And when we come to a country, we are not entering just an area of economic opportunity. We are entering a land with a history.
Mm.
And history has a peculiar way of repeating itself unless we learn from it. So
Yeah.
there's a very strong imperative to learn from history. So why did these things happen? What were the mindsets that shaped these events? And how can we avoid repeating some of those things in the future, right?
Hello. Welcome to Chai Across Generations. This podcast is for anyone who wants to explore or improve their relationship with their culture, their relationships with loved ones in other generations, and ultimately their relationship with themselves. Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday in the US that celebrates the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. Shankar and I had a good conversation that we wanted to share on the podcast today about the holiday itself, the movement that he championed, and some similarities and differences between the South Asian experience and the Black experience. We also talk about discrimination, especially in the form of colorism, and how it's important to learn about the histories of other communities without assuming that we know their experience. So let's dive in. All right, Shankar. So today we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Day and civil rights. So wanted to hear from you, what does MLK Day mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nikhil. I think, you know, given that I came from India and what we learned about the US in terms of history when we were growing up uh, was much less than probably what you guys learned about US history. So, I mean, the name was familiar to us. I'm sure we learned about, some of that background. Um, but I think when I first came here, I wasn't that terribly, mm, you know, caught up in the significance of it.
Mm.
Um, until, like I said, for me, a big part of my understanding of, Black culture came from music. And so as I got more into the music over the years, spending, say, 5, 10 years here, and uh, embedded in the blues music is the story of the blacks, all the way from because the music talks about Mississippi is where it starts in the Delta or Texas, and sharecropping. A lot of the blues is about that, or blues about being imprisoned, often for crimes that they did not commit or were wrongly accused of, right? Natural disasters and the suffering of the black people, right? Or being enslaved. There's some of it is just really hard, chain gang blues or stuff like that. So to me, my introduction to their story was very organic. It was literally through storytellers telling the music,
Mm.
and then I think a big change came when about 7 or 8 years ago, locally here they were organizing an event on Martin Luther King Day at one of the local churches. And in Ames, how they do it is that event rotates from one church to the next,
Mm.
and it's an interfaith event. So they invite faith leaders from all the different faiths who are represented in our community. And it turned out that for a while, someone was representing the Hindu faith, and for some reason, my name was given, and they contacted me. And after that, it assumed a very different significance because I'd go to this event and meet other people, and there was a beautiful celebration. There were, reminiscences, videos of, the I Had a Dream speech or other things. And it's also when I started learning about Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and how they met and how Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by nonviolent satyagraha and things like that. And so there's a very intimate connection actually for Indians if we choose to look closely at that. But I'm sorry to say that I think in my generation, I don't see as much awareness about it. In fact, sadly enough, I think there is a fair amount of, um, um, racism, in India itself. I mean, there is in the sense of color. So there's a lot of assumptions that are made based on color and other characteristics, which kind of carry over, and many prejudices that we have, often associating the characters of a race with the conditions in which they're found, which is, maybe poverty, lack of economic opportunity, and stuff like that. So to me, it's very significant. I think this is a very remarkable human being who lived and animated, very similar to our own Mahatma Gandhi, really a father of the nation in some sense here. But I watched this movie called Malcolm X, which was the other great black leader. And so to me, that whole interaction between Nation of Islam and Dr. Martin Luther King, and there are many other visionary figures there. From where came people like the more modern, representatives, Jesse Jackson and people like that, right? Louis Farrakhan and others. So it's a fascinating, subject for me, and I think it's a very important part of our American history. Civil rights was a landmark, and sometimes it surprised me that a society that had, the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and all that, it seemed very much at odds with the idealism of that language to confront the reality of Jim Crow and segregation and stuff like that. So I think it's a very important topic. What are your thoughts?
Right.
When you think of, yeah.
Yeah. I am so glad you spoke a lot about the legacy of civil rights. That's what comes to my mind. Growing up here in America, we learned about MLK Day and about his I Have the Dream speech, I Have a Dream. And it's kind of almost tied up as a neat story that this was something that was an injustice in our society that has since passed. And then you learn more as you grow up that that's not quite true, that racism exists in different forms, and maybe it's a little bit more covert. And as, South Asians, I think many of us have experienced at least some examples of microaggressions or, discrimination. So, like you said, there is a little bit of a kinship there with the Black experience, although it's also very different because we have to talk about the experience of slavery and the experience of Jim Crow segregation, and the continued struggles with, the police and the effect on African American communities. So it's a good reminder that we still have a ways to go to get to equality for all. And to point out some of the parallels, you mentioned, I think you mentioned the Civil Rights Act, right, of 1965,
Right.
Which was just a huge boon for so many South Asians to then have the right to immigrate a little bit more readily. And a lot of our families here, I mean, I'd stake a claim to say that Civil Rights Act is a huge reason why you and I are able to be here today in conversation as two South Asians in America. So the legacy of MLK extends to you and me. And then I was also going to talk about colorism, which you already tackled. Colorism is the idea that, fair-skinned folks are better than others, or that darker skin means, I don't know, lesser than in some way. And it drives me crazy. It just drives me crazy. There's so much of that still embedded in our culture. I think it gets better with generations, but
Right.
Even today, if you go to a wedding in South India, right? So much of the chatter is about like the fairness of the bride and groom.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like, oh, they have a little bit of color. And it just drives me crazy. And it's this idea that like lighter tone is more beautiful, is also embedded in some of the big companies in India. Like, I think we may have talked about this on a previous episode, but Fair and Lovely was like the biggest healthcare brand, or not healthcare brand, cosmetics brand, right, in India. Fair and Lovely.
Lovely, right.
engendering those ideals of colorism. I think they've since changed to glow and lovely, which is
I'm
which is
glad.
better. Which is better. They
Yeah,
took fair out, but
yeah,
for so
yeah.
long that was embedded right in the title, right in the company name.
Thank you very much for giving the accurate definition of colorism and for picking up on exactly what I was trying to say while I was fumbling so hard for the
No,
right word.
you did a good
Appreciate
job.
it. Right. But you're right. I completely agree with you. And it was embedded in the advertising, like you said, culturally, and the ideals of women's beauty is that. Whereas dark and dusky is so beautiful, right? And there's real beauty in all the skin tones that we can see, and beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So it's good that we are re-educating ourselves that every skin tone has its own beauty,
Yes. Yeah.
and there's no reason. The other thing that you brought up, which I think is very important, is I think a lot of people may not really understand the consequences of slavery, because on the face of it, it's somebody in bondage, and you think, well, if they're freed, then it's over, right? But it's not that easy, because if you think about it, these people were stripped from their homelands, brought forcibly across the ocean, and not only that, they were stripped from their parents. Okay, and there is nothing more violent and cruel that you can do in any court of law. It's not just a court of man's law, it's in the court of God's law, then like forcibly separating a child from its parents, ripping its identity, its heritage, its history from it. Okay, and I really think Indians need to think about this a lot more, because I think we too often dismiss the consequences of slavery.
Yeah.
And you're right, we cannot, although we do experience similar, racist or microaggressions or whatever, there's a vast difference. You
Yes.
see, we have the benefit of the heritage of our family histories, right? Of say a legacy of say educational improvement or whatever, and that's a huge difference, right? So it's very and it bothers me very much when sometimes Indians stand up in a public forum and claim to speak for all races.
Mm.
Well, you can't, because the experience of the blacks is very unique. We can feel a kindred spirit. We can feel a great deal of compassion. We can feel a great deal of solidarity, but we cannot co-opt that experience. And that would be a grave injustice, social injustice, to do that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I agree with you. What I would add to what you're saying is we have to have a sensitivity toward the Black experience. And we have to fight the notion that because we have also experienced some forms of discrimination, that we're all in the same bucket. We're not. Like,
Right.
our experiences are completely different. The traumatic experience of having families and lives uprooted and, brought to America to then be indentured servants and slaves is, we have no corollary to that on the scale that they do, right? And
Yeah.
like you said, the intergenerational effects, intergenerational trauma, can be passed down generation to generation. So I think we can continue to educate ourselves and to learn about the experience of, our friends from different communities today. We can do that. We can each do that today.
Right.
But we also have to work on this colorism thing. We cannot continue to, I don't know, have folks show up at different events and comment on the color or lack of color of someone's appearance. Like,
Right.
and maybe that will never change. That some older generations are steeped in that way. Like, maybe that's not realistic, but we have to keep pushing for that.
I think it can change. One of the good things about social media and the extreme interconnectedness now is that ideas do spread. Good ideas as well spread
Mm.
rapidly, and I think there's hope.
But do you
Yeah,
think that can change for, let's say, grandparents' generation, right? People over 60, 65. That's the thing. I don't know if we can
uh,
expect them to change. And
probably not.
right,
Yeah,
right. So, but
yeah,
I agree
yeah,
with you for people who are younger, relatively younger.
right, right.
We have to hopefully try to be a little bit more thoughtful about the way we speak about this.
Yes, I agree. I agree. What else? Tell me more about your experience with MLK Day growing up here.
I mean, I think it was a school holiday that was always nice, especially coming off of, you just get off for Christmas, New Year's, and you come back and you have MLK Day off. So that was a
Right.
nice, refreshing break. What about for you?
That's something that does strike me. That although we declare it a national holiday, right? Uh, what does it do to educate people a little more about his life, even in schools, right? Because that's one place you can do it. As I mentioned, we have community events, but how many people actually attend those events, right? I
Right.
had the somehow fortuitous opportunity to get plugged into that, and I've really enjoyed being a part of that. But I think it's a missed opportunity there,
Mhm.
right? To re-educate ourselves, and I probably at the same time, one not to be overbearing, you have to have a certain interest in it. But like you pointed out, there are so many, I feel, shared experiences and shared values and shared goals between the South Asian community, or immigrant communities in general,
Right.
in the U.S., and the Black experience, that it seems to me a very obvious intersection of you know camaraderie and interest, right? But somehow I think that's it still feels to me like a bit of a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good point. And I think a lot of it for me happened individually.
Mm-hmm.
After the George Floyd incident, I took it on myself to read a little bit more. I read a couple different
Right.
books to try to educate myself. That was, you know, a harrowing event, and
Mm-hmm.
it led me to educate myself further. So
Right.
I think we have to find motivations. I wish it was more, I don't know, societally provided on a day like MLK Day. Uh,
Right.
but in the absence of that, I think maybe we have space to do that ourselves and to discuss with our loved ones.
Exactly. And in a way, that's why I'm glad that you brought up this topic, because we can use our podcast. So for me, for instance, there's a Billie Holiday song called Strange Fruit. And I don't know if you've
Hmm,
heard that.
I haven't.
It's a very powerful and chilling song about Jim Crow and lynching.
Hmm.
And if you go back to the musicians of the day, Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, and we talk about George Floyd, but the historical thing is Emmett Till, right, from
Hmm.
the,
Yep.
the the very young boy. So there's a history to this. It didn't start with George Floyd, right? It's a
Yeah.
very long history to this.
Absolutely.
And I remember, I don't know if it was to you or someone else that I shared this thing called, there's a Zinn project on history. We talked about that.
Oh yeah, I think you
That
did mention
actually,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that has an excellent documentation of all the suffering of the blacks in many events, and it's very educational to go in and read that how this didn't start recently. It has a very
Yeah.
long history, and I think educating ourselves about that is a very powerful reminder
Yeah.
as to why this has happened. And the Selma Montgomery, Rosa Parks. I mean, these are things that I think it would be great if all Americans would be able to remember and relate to, and be aware of what happened,
Yeah.
because it's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. MLK Day is a reminder to me that great communicators listen,
Yeah,
right? both from MLK and what he did, but also, we talked about that on a previous episode. If I, let's say, I'll put myself here, if I want to be the type of person I want to be, I probably should listen a lot more than I speak, right? And on MLK Day, on the history of the Black experience and the continued fight for equality for all, I have one perspective from one particular culture. That's valuable for sure, but I cannot then assume that I know what other people's experiences are like. So what you're saying is reminding me, this idea of looking at the Zen project or other resources. It's a reminder to just kind of stay humble and realize, to seek it out and to realize we have so much to learn.
Right. And when we come to a country, we are not entering just an area of economic opportunity. We are entering a land with a history. And history has a peculiar way of repeating itself unless we learn from it.
Right.
Right.
Great point.
So
Yeah.
there's a very, 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 very strong imperative to learn from history. So why did these things happen? What were the mindsets that shaped these events? And how can we avoid repeating some of those things in the future, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Some simple questions that we'll leave our listeners with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think they're good food for thought, absolutely, for all of us.
Yeah.
Especially as you think about the patterns over time, right, and how we have the opportunity to break cycles, right,
Yeah.
as this current generation that's living on the planet, and so we want to do our part to try to end some of those, those unproductive or harmful or hurtful cycles.
Yep. Wonderful,
Perfect.
Nikhil. That is a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Shankar.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to this week's show. We hope you enjoy the holiday and take a few minutes to think about what this day means to you. You've heard what we think, so we'd now love to hear what resonated with you from the discussion on either YouTube, and our channel is Chai Across Generations, or via email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at Chai Across Generations. And we mentioned it last time, but we have some travel coming up, so we'll release a little bit more infrequently over the next couple of weeks, but we'll be back as we head into February. And in the meantime, you can tell us what topics you'd like to hear, either in the comments or over email. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you all next time.